What's up, girls and boys? What's up, internet? Are you ready to dive into a land rife with treasures and mysteries, where terrifying monsters lurk at every corner? I am Bianca, and this is my honest thoughts and impressions on Shinobi Games and Nippon Ichi Software's dungeon crawling experience, Labyrinth Legend, for the Nintendo Switch. A legendary kingdom on the ends of this world, Kanata. Terrifying monsters lurk in this kingdom. The lost royal treasure is hidden in the cursed labyrinth here. Rumors of this treasure spread amongst the people from an unknown source. Many adventurers make their way to Kanata, some in search of treasure, while others seek adventure. However, not one of these adventurers have ever made it back alive. Now, a single adventurer has made their way to the kingdom of Kanata. That is basically the gist of Labyrinth Legend's story. We are an adventurer harboring the abilities of one of three unique classes: the Strider, the Wizard, and the Nightcrawler, who got caught up in the curse of the Kingdom of Kanata, and whether for glory or to simply obtain the lost treasures of the royal family, we must now venture forth into the monster-infested labyrinths to not just test our skills, but also put an end to the Queen's curse. It's a simple enough premise, and the simplicity is mirrored throughout the game, whether it be for the controls, the dungeon mechanics, the enemies, and the overall gameplay loop, which basically consists of you making preparations to venture into one of the 13 labyrinths accessible in the game, make your way through these auto-generated dungeons, fighting the enemies as you go, leveling up and acquiring better gear than the one you set out with, encounter these larger-than-life bosses with their own attack patterns, which, depending on your equipment, skill level, and difficulty setting of choice, you can choose to memorize and evade these patterns, or simply go crazy and brute force your way into victory. Obtain the treasures of that dungeon and unlock new locations, rinse, and repeat. Speaking of difficulty settings, this title has 3: Casual, Normal, and Veteran. Casual, of course, is for those who are new to action games and who would rather not have to deal with the frustration of repeatedly being defeated in battle, or those who don't really have that much time to grind levels and equipment. This difficulty setting offers reduced damage and reduced enemy HP. Normal difficulty is for players who want to enjoy battles and who are not new to the genre. It is also the default difficulty of the game, while Veteran is for those who aren't satisfied with the normal difficulty and wanted to challenge themselves further. This difficulty setting offers changes in enemy behavior patterns, increased damage, and increased enemy HP. And even though you are asked to choose at the beginning of the game what difficulty you would want, you can easily change it afterwards by speaking with Michibiki in the village. As I've said before, there are 3 classes to choose from: the Strider, who fights using various weaponry able to guard attacks; the Wizard, an expert in the magical arts who wields staves and able to focus to regenerate their MP; and the newly added exclusive Switch-only class, the Nightcrawler, someone who fights with forbidden powers such as their awakening skill and who specializes in physical attacks. Each of these classes has their own strengths and weaknesses, and though I did try all of them myself, I ended up using the Strider the most because of its very useful guard ability, which saved me countless of times when I was still starting out in the game. Labyrinth Legend's story isn't told in the typical fashion where it is spoon-fed to you in cutscenes. Rather, you learn more about the kingdom, the people trapped within, the labyrinths, the curse, and everything else in between by talking to the NPCs in the village, whose dialogue changes the more labyrinths you clear. To complete the story, 9 different labyrinths need to be conquered. Each of them have their own unique boss battles, soundtrack, set of enemies, map styles, and gimmicks. Granted, the enemy sprites look largely the same with just a variance in the color palette, but their attack patterns are something else entirely. Labyrinths are further unlocked as you progress through the game, with some unlocking as post-game content. There is also the arena, where you can fight through waves of enemies and get rewards based on how long you can survive and how many waves you have defeated. And the soul cage, where you can interact with the souls of what I assume to be the bosses in the game while trying to find flowers that can detoxify the poison you obtain from staying in this realm for so long. Of these two, it is the soul cage that I found myself unable to complete or even comprehend how I am supposed to use those aforementioned flowers to survive long enough to explore this labyrinth further than just a few rooms of its first floor. So it's something we're not going to tackle despite it being one of the prettiest levels I've played in this title. The level of difficulty for Labyrinth Legend is quite forgiving. Even though you get thrown out of the dungeon or the labyrinth you are in when you are defeated, as you are traversing these areas, dying at the hands of a boss gives you several options you could choose. Returning to the village, retrying the area/the stage, or retrying the boss battle itself. Restarting the boss battle will give you full health and replenish the potions you have already used. In all honesty, the only levels that gave me quite a hard time for being underleveled are the post-game ones and the aforementioned soul cage. These levels have the most annoying mobs in the entire game, especially the sanctuary post-game stage. Speaking of being underleveled, you level up by fighting enemies and bosses, though from what I noticed, your levels are only tied to one stat, your health. Every other stat is dependent on the gear you acquire, whether through dungeon and enemy chests and loots, or by purchasing them in the village shop. These equipment can also be upgraded through the blacksmith to unlock more of that weapon or armors, especially if it's at a higher rarity, additional stats and bonuses. As for the special attacks and other upgrades such as the amount of health potions you can carry, the amount of magic points you have, the amount of items you can store in your bag and your storage, the amount of magical ingredients you can store, and facility expansions like Mine and Monster Island ones, plus the ever-useful Soul Stone that allows you to be resurrected once during a stage, can be bought at the general store. Each weapon has their own special attack, and you can only use these attacks if you bought the corresponding skill in the general store and have that weapon equipped. The runes, which are the magic you can equip in this title, also has special attacks you can buy, and these are very useful, especially the flame rune, which became an instant favorite for me. The mine and the Monster Island are two of the very useful facilities in the village. The Monster Island allows you to recruit monsters by paying up a certain number of magical ingredients to the island's keeper, Oma. These monsters accompany you in your expeditions, and each have their own useful special abilities, from ones that can heal you every time you go up a floor, to those that can double the amount of coins you get, and those that has a chance of finding weapons each floor, just to name a few. The mine, on the other hand, will exchange ores for magical ingredients, and what ores you get depend on how much you expanded the mine. These ores are useful for when you want to upgrade your equipment. Be warned, however, that regardless of the rarity, each piece of equipment can only be upgraded up to 5 times. If you find traversing these dungeons to be quite hard, especially the post-game content, then you might be interested to know that local co-op is available via the pub or the tavern, and it could be played with up to 4 players. The game also has an amazing soundtrack, which kind of reminds me of those from other games, like a melody from Lunar Silver Star Story Complete being reminiscent to the soundtrack used in the village. Listening to the soundtrack in the game as you play lessens the chore the repetitive nature of Labyrinth Legends gameplay brings. As I mentioned before, controls are easy and simple enough, and if you want to change the control scheme, you can also do so by heading to the options menu of the game, accessible by pressing the plus button on the Switch controller and selecting the cogwheel icon, then heading over to the button button. That being said, I didn't like how the dodge and the guard buttons are one and the same, and how you can't separate them into 2 different button configurations, like how it is set up in the East games. There are also moments that I notice the inputs lag, especially when you're being mobbed by a lot of enemies on screen. And I think that apart from there not being that much variety in the kinds of enemies that we encounter, and how most, if not all, of the enemies are basically just recolors of the same sprites from the same enemies we've encountered a few dungeons or labyrinths back, then this whole control scheme, how the dodge and the guard buttons are one and the same, is among my biggest complaint of them all when it comes to Labyrinth Legend. If you want to play more of the game, not only does additional difficulty for the dungeons you've completed appear as you progress through the game story, there is also an extra game option accessible in Labyrinth Legend's title screen. In Extra Game, which is best played after beating the main story of the game and getting a good feel to the game's mechanics, randomly generated dungeons with randomly generated enemies await you, and your goal is to get to the very bottom level to complete this game mode. Whatever equipment, items, and level you obtain during a run is wiped clean and lost when you die, and magical ingredients are obtained by releasing elements, which are then used to upgrade or change the mechanics in this mode. This is, by far, the true challenge of the game, and one that fans and enthusiasts, or those who simply want to enjoy roguelites, will have the most fun with. Overall, this is a good addition to your library if you're looking for something you can play in quick intermittent sessions, as dungeons are pretty short and wouldn't take more than 15 minutes to beat. Unless you're trying to do the extra game, which is a different story entirely. Also, if you are willing to overlook its graphical choice. Video games are more than their graphics. Though don't play this game if you are after an interesting story, as it doesn't have that much in it, and what it has is very lacking. So, if you guys fancy a challenge that is pretty addicting and fun to play, with completing each dungeon giving you a satisfying feeling, then you might enjoy Labyrinth Legend on the Nintendo Switch. But anyways, this is just my honest thoughts and impressions on this title, which I have spent almost 9 hours and counting in. I've yet to beat the Sanctuary post-game dungeon, the Soul Cage, and the extra game, and I'm not stopping until I do. So take what I've said about this game with that in mind. And that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, you guys know the drill. Dream on, fly on. Bye bye for now. Keep safe, everyone.